Hurricane Artemis was bearing down on the Florida coast with the fury of nature unleashed. Category 5 winds, 180 miles per hour sustained gusts, and a storm surge that threatened to wipe entire communities off the map. At Homestead Emergency Operations Center, chaos reigned as desperate calls flooded in from Pelican Island, a small barrier island where 60 people, including 20 children, were trapped in a collapsing shelter. "We need immediate evacuation," crackled the radio from the island. "The storm surge is rising faster than predicted. The building won't hold much longer." Flight Commander Rick Harrison, 35 years old and full of military precision, stared at the weather radar with growing desperation. Every rescue helicopter in the region had been grounded. The Coast Guard cutters couldn't navigate the massive swells. Commercial aircraft were nowhere to be found. The window for rescue was closing fast. "Sir," called out Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell from the communications desk, "we have one aircraft still operational at Homestead Air Reserve Base. An old C-130 transport that was scheduled for decommission. Do we have a pilot qualified to fly it in these conditions?" Harrison demanded. The room fell silent. Every certified pilot had either been evacuated or was grounded by emergency protocols. Flying in a Category 5 hurricane was considered a suicide mission. That's when 78-year-old Eleanor "Stormy" Rodriguez stepped forward from the corner where she'd been quietly observing the crisis unfold. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her weathered hands steady despite her age. She wore a simple volunteer coordinator badge, but her eyes held the calm confidence of someone who'd seen worse storms than this. "I can fly it," she said quietly. The entire room turned to stare at her. Harrison's expression shifted from desperation to disbelief to something approaching anger. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this is a military operation. We need qualified pilots, not..." "Not what?" Eleanor interrupted, her voice carrying an edge that made several people straighten. "Not a 78-year-old woman?" Lieutenant Mitchell snickered from her position at the radio. "Look, Grandma, we appreciate the offer, but flying a C-130 isn't like driving to the grocery store. These are complex military aircraft that require years of training and..." 43 years of training to be precise," Eleanor said calmly. "Captain Eleanor Rodriguez, retired. 26 years active duty, 17 years civilian contract pilot. I've flown C-130s through hurricanes, tornadoes, and combat zones you've never heard of." The room erupted in uncomfortable laughter. Harrison shook his head dismissively. "Ma'am, I'm sure you have stories, but this is 2024. Modern aircraft have computer systems, GPS navigation, digital flight controls. This isn't World War II anymore." "You're right," Eleanor agreed. "It's not World War II. The C-130 you're talking about is probably a J model with glass cockpit displays, advanced weather radar, and fly-by-wire controls. I helped test those systems when you were in elementary school." Captain James Wong, the meteorologist on duty, looked up from his weather tracking equipment. "Commander Harrison, the storm is intensifying. We have maybe 2 hours before those people on Pelican Island are beyond help. If she's really qualified..." "She's not qualified," Harrison exploded. "She's a senior citizen volunteer who probably hasn't flown anything more complex than a rental car in the last decade." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out a worn leather wallet. From it, she extracted a pilot's license that made Harrison's jaw drop. Current medical certificate, instrument rating, multi-engine certification, and a list of aircraft endorsements that read like an aviation museum catalog. "Current as of last month," she said simply. "I may be 78, but I've never stopped flying. The question isn't whether I can fly that C-130. The question is whether you're going to let your prejudices kill 60 people." The radio crackled with increasing desperation from Pelican Island. "Emergency! Emergency! The water is up to the 2nd floor. We need immediate evacuation. Children are crying. The building is starting to shake." Harrison stared at the weather display, then at Eleanor, then at the faces of his team who were all watching this impossible decision unfold. Every protocol said no. Every regulation said it was insane. But 60 lives hung in the balance and time was running out. "Ma'am," he said finally, "even if you are qualified, flying into a Category 5 hurricane is beyond dangerous. It's basically suicide. The winds alone could tear the aircraft apart." Eleanor smiled, and for the first time, everyone in the room saw a glimpse of the pilot she'd once been. "Son, I didn't survive 4 decades of flying by being reckless. I survived by being better than the weather, better than the aircraft, and better than people's expectations." She turned to address the room. "In 1987, I flew relief supplies into Hurricane Gilbert in Jamaica. In 1992, I was part of the Hurricane Andrew relief effort right here in Florida. In 2005, I flew rescue missions during Katrina when every other pilot said it couldn't be done. I've landed C-130s on aircraft carriers in 40-foot swells on jungle airstrips under enemy fire, and in blizzards that made this hurricane look like a spring shower. Lieutenant Mitchell's skeptical expression was beginning to waver. But ma'am, you'd be flying alone in the worst conditions imaginable, to rescue people from an island that might be underwater by the time you get there. No, Eleanor corrected. I'd be flying to save 60 human beings including 20 children because that's what pilots do. We don't calculate odds, we calculate possibilities. The radio erupted again. Mayday. Mayday. Water is breaching the 3rd floor. We're running out of time. Harrison closed his eyes, probably ending his career with his next words. Gear her up. Get that C-130 prepped for immediate departure. The next 30 minutes were a whirlwind of activity as Eleanor transformed from dismissed elderly volunteer to focused professional pilot. Her pre-flight inspection was a masterclass in aviation expertise, every check performed with surgical precision, every system verified with the confidence of someone who knew these aircraft better than their designers. Ma'am, called Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, no relation despite the shared name, as Eleanor completed her external inspection. The Weather Service is reporting sustained winds of 180 miles per hour with gusts to 220. The flight is being classified as extremely hazardous to impossible. Eleanor looked up at the storm clouds that were already beginning to darken the afternoon sky. Sergeant, impossible is just another word for untested. In 43 years of flying, I've learned that aircraft are capable of much more than their specifications suggest, and pilots are capable of much more than their age suggests. As she climbed into the cockpit, Eleanor felt the familiar embrace of an environment where she'd spent more time than in any house she'd ever owned. Her hands found the controls with muscle memory that transcended age, her eyes scanned the instruments with the speed of someone who'd done this thousands of times. Homestead Tower, this is Rescue 7 requesting immediate clearance for emergency departure. The tower controller's voice came back uncertain. Rescue 7, be advised winds are currently gusting to 95 miles per hour with severe turbulence reported at all altitudes. Are you sure you want to proceed? Tower, I've been flying through bad weather since before weather radar was invented. Trust me, this isn't my first storm. What happened next became the stuff of aviation legend. Eleanor lifted the C-130 into conditions that would have challenged pilots half her age with twice her recent flight time. The aircraft bucked and fought like a living thing as she guided it into the teeth of Hurricane Artemis, but her steady hands and decades of experience kept it on course toward Pelican Island. Back at the operations center, everyone watched the radar track with growing amazement. Eleanor wasn't just flying through the hurricane, she was finding the eye wall's weak points, riding the updrafts, using the storm's own energy to power her flight toward the island. How is she doing that? Whispered Lieutenant Mitchell, her earlier skepticism replaced by awe. Captain Wong studied the meteorological data. She's flying the storm, not fighting it. Look at her altitude changes, she's finding the calm spaces between pressure cells, riding thermals that most pilots wouldn't even recognize. The flight to Pelican Island took Eleanor through conditions that redefined her understanding of severe weather. Winds that tried to flip the aircraft, rain that hammered the windscreen like bullets, and turbulence that would have reduced most pilots to prayer and panic. But Eleanor had flown through worse, and more importantly, she'd flown with purpose that transcended personal safety. Pelican Island Emergency Shelter, this is Rescue 7. I'm 5 minutes out. Be ready for immediate evacuation. I can't stay on the ground long in these conditions. The voice that came back was filled with desperate relief. Rescue 7, thank God. We're ready. Kids are scared but mobile. Adults are helping. Please hurry. Eleanor's landing on Pelican Island was a masterpiece of precision flying under impossible conditions. The small airstrip was being battered by crosswinds that should have made landing impossible, but she brought the C-130 down with the gentle touch of someone placing a sleeping child in bed. The evacuation was conducted with military efficiency born of desperation. 60 people, families with crying children, elderly residents who'd refused to leave their homes, emergency workers who'd stayed behind to help, filed into the aircraft with the speed of people who knew they were being given a second chance at life. Ma'am, called one of the emergency workers as the last child was buckled in, how did you know you could land in these conditions? Eleanor was already running through her takeoff checklist, preparing for what would be an even more challenging departure. Son, I didn't know I could land. I knew I had to land. There's a difference. The takeoff from Pelican Island tested every skill Eleanor had acquired in 4 decades of flying. The wind shear was extreme, the visibility near zero, and the aircraft was loaded beyond normal passenger capacity. But she lifted the C-130 into the storm with the grace of someone who understood that aircraft were meant to fly, regardless of conditions. The return flight was a testament to the marriage of experience and determination. Eleanor guided her precious cargo through hurricane conditions that would have grounded commercial aviation for weeks, finding safe passage through atmospheric chaos that defied conventional wisdom. Homestead Tower, Rescue 7 requesting emergency landing clearance. I have 60 souls on board, all safe, all accounted for. The tower controller's voice was barely controlled emotion. Rescue 7, you are cleared for immediate landing. Emergency vehicles are standing by. Ma'am, that was the most incredible piece of flying we've ever witnessed. Eleanor's landing at Homestead was greeted by a crowd of emergency personnel, media, and officials who'd watched the entire rescue unfold on radar. As she shut down the engines and opened the cargo door, 60 grateful people emerged into safety, many of them crying with relief. Commander Harrison was the first to approach Eleanor as she completed her post-flight inspection. His expression was a mixture of awe, gratitude, and the humility that comes from being completely wrong about someone. Ma'am, he said, his voice barely audible over the wind, I owe you an apology. And these people owe you their lives. Eleanor looked at the families being reunited, the children who were safe because someone had been willing to risk everything for strangers, the emergency workers who could continue their mission because one pilot had refused to accept impossible. Commander, she said quietly, you don't owe me anything. But maybe next time, you'll remember that competence doesn't have an expiration date, courage doesn't diminish with age, and sometimes the most unlikely hero is exactly the right person for the job. The story of Eleanor Rodriguez's hurricane rescue spread across the nation within hours. Video of her pre-flight inspection, audio of her calm radio communications during the flight, and interviews with the 60 people she'd saved created a narrative that transcended age, gender, and preconceptions about heroism. I've been flying for 30 years, one airline pilot posted on social media, and I wouldn't have attempted what that 78-year-old woman did today. She didn't just save 60 lives, she redefined what we think we know about courage and capability. The children she'd rescued sent hand-drawn pictures showing a silver-haired woman piloting an airplane through dark clouds with hearts and rainbows around the edges. The parents wrote letters describing how her calm presence during the flight had kept everyone from panicking, how her gentle voice over the intercom had assured them they were in capable hands. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from the aviation community itself. Within a week, Eleanor received calls from flight schools asking her to share her experience, from aircraft manufacturers wanting to consult with her about extreme weather operations, and from the Federal Aviation Administration requesting her input on emergency response protocols. Mrs. Rodriguez, said the chief administrator during a phone call from Washington, your flight has prompted us to review our entire approach to age restrictions and experience evaluation. We'd like to discuss how we can better utilize senior pilots in emergency situations. Eleanor accepted some of the invitations and politely declined others. She wasn't interested in fame or recognition. She was interested in making sure that the next time people faced impossible odds, someone would be ready to attempt the impossible. 3 months after Hurricane Artemis, Eleanor established the Storm Rider Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to training emergency pilots and maintaining aircraft for disaster response. Her first class of students included pilots from every demographic imaginable, united not by their age or background but by their commitment to putting service above safety. Flying, she told her students during their first briefing, is not about conquering the sky. It's about working with the sky, understanding its moods, respecting its power, and finding ways to achieve the impossible when impossible is the only option. Commander Harrison, who had been promoted after the successful Pelican Island rescue, became one of Eleanor's strongest advocates. He instituted new policies at emergency operations centers across the region, emphasizing competence over demographics and experience over assumptions. The Eleanor Rodriguez Protocol, as it became known, required emergency coordinators to evaluate all available resources based on capability rather than preconceptions. Age became irrelevant if skills were current. Gender became meaningless if experience was documented. Background became secondary to qualifications. 1 year after the hurricane, Pelican Island dedicated a memorial to Eleanor's rescue, not a monument to her heroism, but a weather station that would provide early warning for future storms. The plaque read simply, "In honor of Eleanor Rodriguez, who proved that heroes come in all ages, and that sometimes the sky needs someone who remembers how to dance with storms. Eleanor continued flying well into her 80s, conducting training flights, emergency missions, and demonstration flights that inspired a new generation of pilots to look beyond conventional limitations. She never spoke about age as a barrier, only as an accumulation of experience that made challenging flights more manageable rather than more difficult. "People ask me about flying at my age," she said during her final public interview before retiring at 85, as if age somehow diminishes ability. But experience doesn't. Get old, it gets better. Judgment doesn't age, it matures. And courage doesn't diminish with years, it deepens with understanding. The 60 people Eleanor saved during Hurricane Artemis continued to stay in touch with her, their families becoming an extended community of gratitude that spanned generations. The children she'd rescued grew up knowing that heroes don't always look like the pictures in storybooks, that courage can come from unexpected sources, and that sometimes the most important lesson is learning to see beyond appearances to recognize true capability. When Eleanor finally passed away at 89, her funeral was attended by hundreds of pilots, thousands of emergency responders, and 60 people who owed their lives to a woman who'd refused to let others' limitations define her possibilities. The military honor guard that flew over the ceremony included aircraft from every branch of service, a testament to how one person's courage had inspired an entire profession. The story of Hurricane Artemis became required reading in aviation schools, not just for its technical flying lessons but for its human ones. Eleanor Rodriguez had proven that experience was more valuable than youth, that wisdom could overcome physical limitations, and that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person everyone needs. Her legacy lived on in the Storm Rider Foundation, which continued training emergency pilots decades after her death. In the aircraft hangar where student pilots learned to navigate impossible weather, a simple sign reminded everyone of the lesson Eleanor had taught the world. They laughed when she said, "I can fly it." She responded by saving 60 lives and proving that competence has no age limit, courage has no expiration date, and heroes come in all forms, especially the ones nobody expects. Commander Harrison, long since retired himself, would often visit the foundation to speak with new classes of pilots. He always ended his presentations the same way. "I once made the mistake of judging a pilot by her age instead of her ability. That mistake almost cost 60 people their lives, and it taught me the most important lesson of my career. Never underestimate someone based on what you think you see. The most capable person in the room might be the one everyone else has dismissed." Eleanor Rodriguez's flight through Hurricane Artemis lasted only 4 hours, but its impact resonated for generations. She proved that heroism wasn't about age or appearance, it was about capability, courage, and the willingness to risk everything for others when others were too afraid to try. In a world that often dismisses people based on age, gender, or preconceptions, Eleanor's story served as a permanent reminder that excellence comes in many forms, heroes emerge from unexpected places, and sometimes the most ordinary-looking person is capable of the most extraordinary things. They laughed when a 78-year-old said, "I can fly it." She responded by redefining what it meant to be a hero, one rescued life at a time.